comforting. That like those apostles, those greats back in the day were kind of not quite sure how to do this, and they were navigating compromises, and for some reason it was really refreshing to me. It's always been really refreshing to me to see it. So let's get into it. Paul spends a lot of time and care in this section pointing out how everything about his ministry is distinctly not due to the influence of any man, and especially not just because of these leaders, these people who are known as important. And he's doing that specifically because he thinks the Galatians are allowing these, saying you need to be getting your faith and your beliefs from something higher than just the people around you. And I'm really not going to spend a lot of time like unpacking Paul's like argument here, because Carrie's going to be taking next week, and it's sort of continuing the same thought process. And then I'm back again and still continuing the same thought process. I'm really more like going to be talking about kind of the interpersonal things going on here, and thinking about how, one, we should be nuanced in our view of leaders within the church, and two, how we should be intentional in how we mold ourselves to different groups of people that we find ourselves in. Intentional meaning making choices to do it when it makes sense for the gospel, and not just being caught up because we don't want to cause conflict or ruffle feathers. I think and I'm further going to say about leaders in the church that sometimes I think we can lift up individuals, but I also think we can sometimes lift up cultural or church heritage in the same way. So it can be cultural or like denominational, or just like kind of our social settings. We can think that's how you need to do it, not like this. And then the tendency to kind of bend to the breeze of social pressure. We're going to, say that Peter was making some mistakes here, because he always gets a bad rap. But also, it's really interesting what happens with Barnabas, and we'll get into that as well. So let's just go ahead and walk through the passage together. I'm just going to read the first 10 verses, and then we're going to talk about that. So it's chapter 2, first 10 verses. Then, after 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem again with Barnabas, taking Titus along too. I went there because of a revelation and presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did so only in a private meeting with the influential people, to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, although he was a Greek. Now this matter arose because of the false brothers with false pretenses, who slipped in unnoticed to spy on our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, to make us slaves. But we did not surrender to them even for a moment, in order that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. But from those who were influential, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God shows no favoritism between. Added nothing to my message. On the contrary, when they saw that I was entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter was entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who empowered Peter for his apostleship to the circumcised also empowered me for my apostleship to the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who had a reputation as pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we would go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They requested only that we remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do. So it's kind of one of Paul's classic long run-on sentences with like a bunch of parentheses or little dashes, if you like that better, in the middle, kind of these like separate little thoughts. So it can be a little bit hard to follow, but he's qualifying his statements a lot as he goes through here for a reason. He's being really careful to say, in chapter 1 at the end, he had talked through how he received his vision from the Lord, and then he went away to Arabia, and John was talking about that last week. And then 14 years later, he finally came and talked to the leaders in Jerusalem. So he's making sure everyone knows, like, I was out preaching this gospel to the Gentiles for a long time, and then I went to Jerusalem. It wasn't like I was there and they gave me this mission to go out. And the first thing that's kind of interesting is what he means when he says, I went and I talked with them in a private meeting with the influential people to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. And I think when you read that, it can kind of sound like he was like, I came in just to check and make sure I actually had it right. But I think his overall argument doesn't fit with that concept. I think he was more like wondering if there was going to be a big disagreement between him and the leaders in Jerusalem, which would cause like a schism within the church. So it's kind of a question of what exactly it means. But he wanted to make sure he was lining up with them and that they were good with what he was saying. And maybe because in 14, maybe they were doing things a little bit differently than him. But he got it from Christ. It's all he needed for 14 years. He didn't have to go to Jerusalem right away, but now he came here, and they, even though he didn't need their approval, they did approve of it also. So he's telling the Galatians, like, hey, what I've got is from God, but also the leaders in Jerusalem, they said it's good too. So from both fronts, you should know. And he, in verse 2, it said he went up because of a revelation and set this before him. So something happened. We don't know. Did Paul have a dream or someone else tell him something? But he had a reason to go to do this because God wanted him to. Is the message. Okay. All of his caveats throughout here, right? He doesn't name them until verse 9. So first he just says, the people who seemed influential. Some translations, there's a lot of talk of them as the pillars of faith. So he doesn't even name them at first, and he kind of says, he really makes sure he says in verse 6, like, they seem to be influential, but to me, no difference. God doesn't make any difference between people. However, I still went and talked to these people who seem to be influential. He's like trying to make sure that in his view, these human leaders are fallible, and Christ is the one whose opinion really matters. And if we go back to chapter 1, when Paul is introing to everybody, remember that he says in verse 8, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be condemned to hell. Which is very strong. So he's been, from the start of this letter, really interested in everyone understanding that he views this gospel that he delivered and is right as something like bigger than any person, including himself, which is an interesting message. And not often something you see from a leader of something, right? That like, what I've given you is bigger than me. So even if I come back later and tell you it's wrong, I'm wrong. Okay, so there's the kind of this overall tone so far that Paul is presenting that sort of indicates leaders should be downplayed a little bit. So bear that in mind. In other places throughout Paul's writings, he talks about leaders in pretty positive ways. He tells people to imitate him and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us, in a couple different places. If you think he wrote Hebrews, there's definitely some words about leaders there. If you don't think he wrote Hebrews, then that's fine. Someone else wrote Hebrews and said, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they're keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. And there's more language there about leaders being really essential to our groups. And then in 1 Timothy, there's a really interesting thing where I kind of wonder if this event in Galatians was in Paul's mind when he was writing this. Maybe not, maybe. Where he says, don't admit a charge against an elder except in the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. As for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all. And he's about to rebuke Peter in the presence of all right here, which is really interesting. But he's calling for the elders to be given kind of like, well, the two witness is kind of a legal requirement. He's saying you can't just let anybody be slandering your leaders, right? There has so there's a nuance to this, right? Like Paul is saying, partly because these Galatians are being pulled astray by false prophets, influential people, we think probably from the Jewish communities of some of the cities that Paul got chased out of, were coming along and telling these new Christians, hey, you need to add some of the Jewish law to your faith or else it's not legitimate. And those Gentiles over there, they need to be circumcised and be like proselytes within the Jewish community is what it seems like he's arguing against. And so he's motivated to point out to the Galatians that the humans around here who are leading you are not the ones who ultimately matter. My commentaries application section for this passage had a really interesting sentence that I sent to Carrie. It says, our religious subculture tends to be dazzled by religious superstars. How thankful we are for pastors like John MacArthur, John Piper, and Mark Driscoll and Tim Keller, and yet we must not venerate them. Which is really prescient because, you know, Mark Driscoll had like a big blow up in the church also, and Mark was being kind of like abusive behind the scenes and stuff. So I thought that was like, you for now. I can't remember his name. Schreiner, right? Yeah, Schreiner. So I suspect that our very congregational Mennonite, especially our group, the way we do leadership, is less likely to fall into this specific trap of like the mega church pastor being like, oh yeah, I believe everything he says, and then being devastated when they turn out to have some problems. But I think I especially, am more likely to ascribe to veneration of idealized versions of dead people that I think were right. And my heritage, and I like Anabaptism a lot, so sometimes I think I could be more prone to being like, I believe all these things, and you're going to have to work hard to prove that wrong, and maybe I err too far on that side. I actually remember as a, 15 or 16-year-old when I was trying to understand Anabaptist theology, and I read some of Menno Simon's stuff. And he has this really extensive pamphlet. They wrote these pamphlets all the time back then, about how Jesus was incarnated not with human flesh, but heavenly flesh. So it wasn't like the Holy Spirit and Mary together made a person who was human and divine. Instead, Mary was just a container, and like he even talks about like Jesus kind of like shrinking and being put in there. So there was like a little shrunken down Jesus man in Mary, and then she popped out. And that, and I remember thinking like, I actually don't know if that's right. Like scientifically not for sure, but then even from a like how the concept is very Gnostic. Like flesh is really bad, so Jesus could not be flesh. He has to be something different all the way through. And I was like, I think that kind of defeats the whole point of the incarnation and Jesus becoming flesh and yet overcoming the flesh that we have also. So, like that's I don't know, I think it's healthy to notice when sometimes the stream you come from had got something wrong and acknowledge it. Even in our little church that's been around for
almost 8 years.
Almost 8 years. I've been struck as I've been trying to write up documents for Jeff, because we're transitioning lead elder roles. He's going to take over for me in July, and like organizing some stuff and like just writing out like the things we do that I realized, oh, Jeff won't know this because it's just what Andrew did, and I was with him from like the start. So when he was done, I just kept most of those things, and I just knew them, but they're just like in my head, you know. And as I've been writing around, I'm like, oh, we actually have like way more little traditions than I thought. And only 8 years, right? It doesn't take long to just like someone, you need a way of doing a thing, and someone just decides, and then that's what you do, unless someone comes up with a reason to change it, right? And I think that, there may be some of these, even as I'm writing them out, some of them I've been like, I don't know if that actually makes that much sense. And I think Jeff might be like, I don't think that makes sense. And I'm curious, I wonder how that will feel here. Like, if Jeff starts changing some of those things, will we be like, hey? Right? I think my point is that the content, the thing, is what should be judged, not who did it, right? And like, it's okay, there needs to be someone in charge who's doing things, and we trust them to do that, because otherwise a group can't function. And it's good also if our leaders have a level of respect and honor that we're like, even if I disagree with you a little bit, we're good. Like, I'll go with that because I know you're in charge. And but I think we should be careful not to do things because that's how Andrew and I did it. We should be doing things that make sense and advance God's mission for the church. And if Jeff has new ideas that make us better at that, then we should be embracing those. And then a final application thing. I think it's foolish to not think that we are influenced by our broader culture. And like, if you think about leaders right now in our nation, especially in politics, like, consider how it's most of the time, it doesn't seem to be issues that matter that much. It's more like who's for it and who's against it. And then if it's my team for it, then yes. And if it's my team against it, then absolutely not. Right? And then just to put it on a point, like, if you're pro-Trump, then everything he says is either correct, or if it doesn't make sense, then he's like bluffing, negotiating, and it'll all come out in the wash later, or one of his advisors is the one who messed it up, right? Or if you're anti-Trump, then everything he says is wrong and probably fascist, and so is anyone who thinks that that was a good idea, right? And like, that's kind of like where we are right now. You're assigning really hard blame. And I think it's that comes through to us, no matter how politically engaged or aloof you are. I think we feel that energy. So it's something to be intentional about, that we should be engaging with issues and content, not just the person behind it. And in this case, with theology and how it matches with Scripture, not just, oh yeah, that guy, I think highly of him, so it must be right. And then I'll just, a sidebar. We're insulated to this to some degree by our leadership model, because we have pretty shared leadership. It's not saying, it's not me up here every week giving you just my views on things. But we're not immune to it. And I think I've felt the flip side of that coin, like a sense, probably false to some degree, that everything kind of relies on me, and if I mess up, the whole group will fall apart. And I think Andrew felt that too, to some level, right? And you can't erase that completely, because someone's in charge eventually. Yeah, and this last year, transitioning to someone else, taking over, has been pretty tough for me. I think most of you know that. Like a mix of maybe injured pride at setting it aside, and self-doubt about what I did, and then some unhealthy comparisons with my father, and fear of disappointing all of you. And I'm really grateful that I'm leaving this role not as the person who was in charge as a sole pastor, but instead as someone who's a part of a team, and where it feels much less than it could be. I think that partly because of that, sharing the load is a really great idea, and I'm willing to fight for it. But I'll just throw out that I think that if we want to continue our leadership structure the way it is and maintain this kind of insulation from having a leader, then we're going to have to work hard to make sure it can stay that way. Because the main thing is time. paid pastor can have dedicated hours to do this job, and in our model, like the person in charge has a couple nights and a weekend or two here or there. And I definitely imagine if I was not also a father and a physician, if you take one of those away, I'd be doing this still. and I think Jeff's gonna feel that same tension, and maybe we're fine with like rotating lead elders every 4 years, but like Miranda and I have been pretty burned out for the last year. I don't want Jeff and Jessica to be burned out for the last year, right? So we're gonna have to, as a group, like if we want this to be the way we do this, like double down and figure out ways to step in for them and make sure they actually hold to their boundaries that they said they're gonna set for themselves, and find ways to step in and make this a group effort like we want it to be, because I think it's really valuable. All right, there's that. I'll do that again at the business meeting. But it was like relevant to this passage. Okay, next, back on track. In verse 11, we're continuing on. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. He's so strong. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? So what was happening here? It seems like Peter was acting as a Gentile, and we don't know exactly what that means. So it probably was more than just like he was sitting with them. Perhaps he was eating unclean animals, or at least sharing dishes with the Gentiles who were eating unclean animals, which would have been unclean. Maybe this was focused on the Lord's Supper specifically, like the communion kind of moment, which seemed to be a meal in this setting. And you know, the church sharing a cup and bread, like were they doing it separately, or like were they all together in one big table, and then this got split when these guys showed up? Who knows? Maybe there definitely seems to be like factions within the church already, and like in Jerusalem seems to be more of the conservative in a Jewish way faction, where, you know, there probably were some gradations there as well. Like some Shriner was saying, like maybe there were some Jews who were like all in like Paul, and they were like, yeah, we're just doing this together, all those rules are done. And maybe there were some who were like, okay, they're in and they don't have to do the stuff, but I'm still doing the stuff. And so we'll just like be in the same room, but not like mixed in with them. And then there may be some who were like, I don't think it's even okay that these people are calling themselves followers of Yahweh. They need to be circumcised and join us. That's kind of what we imagine as maybe the range. So what happened? These men from Jerusalem / James were probably Jewish Christians still observing all the practices of Judaism, and they arrived. The circumcision party pulled in. You gotta wonder what that like flag is like, or logo, you know? Circumcision party. That's it. Anyway. So did this mean that they like pressured Peter to separate from the Gentiles? Like, did they show up and be like, whoa, Peter, like you're violating the law and in sin, and you need to repent? And Peter was like, oh, oops, yeah, I agree, you're right, I'm sorry, I'll come over and sit with you guys. That's the view of some, especially some scholars who like really want this moment to be the start of like a big schism within the church, like a Pauline and Petrine church that follows. Like Peter and Paul's interactions throughout Acts, which are happening later than this, and Peter's writings about him, like in 2 Peter, where, you know, Peter says like, And Paul's writings are really confusing, but they're right, so try your best to understand them. But like, you know, he seems like they're in step with each other. I mean, also against that is like, if James was like, hey, you guys go tell Peter that he needs to stop doing that, and then he showed up, like, it feels strange that Paul wouldn't also call out James here and be like, James is the source of these false prophets who are among you. So Paul doesn't go there, and he doesn't do anything other than like calling Peter out here. So I think it's unlikely that it was so like these guys showed up and convinced Peter he was wrong, and then he repented and left and went over with the Jews. What other things could have happened? Oh wait, side note. Some early church fathers who like really want Peter to be pope do really work hard to make Peter the good guy. I thought this was fun. There's some that say, actually, Paul, this is just a different Cephas. Like, Paul didn't let us know that he was talking about a different Cephas, but he was like, just some random guy Cephas was there, and then he was doing this, and Paul called him out, but it wasn't like Peter. And then another is like, Peter was in on it with Paul, and this was all like a big kind of like farce. Like he kind of tricked everyone to set Paul up so that Paul could like make a really convincing point, and then everyone would be like, yeah, okay, you're right. We should just do this. We should just let the Gentiles. And, okay, more likely things. I think that Peter heard these guys were coming and thought to himself something like, oh man, the politics in Jerusalem are going to be wild if Benjamin and Levi see me eating, non-cloven hooved land animals with these Gentiles. I'm going to just avoid that conflict and just like sit over here with some kosher goodies, and then we'll just wait until they leave, and then it's good. Maybe this was just the Lord's Supper, like the one meal after the service. These guys showed up at church and he wasn't expecting them. And then like, oh, okay, this is happening, and he like just tried to sit in line with them, and then he just sat in their corner, and he kind of kept it kind of cool. Maybe also this was just a moment of fearful inconsistency with what he believed. We've seen Peter do that before, right? Just like all of a sudden these guys are here, he knew it would be a conflict, and he just chose to avoid it. Because again, against the argument that Peter really changed his mind here, like consider he's the guy in Acts 10, which is probably before this, that he got a vision from God saying, go eat these unclean animals, and he came back and told everyone like, hey guys, I had this vision, I think it means this message is for everyone, we have to let the Gentiles in too. Like he stood up and did that already. So he's clearly on that side, but for some reason he chose to go kind of like give in to this crowd that came and make so that it seemed like he was just on their team, like he really wasn't. Whatever it was, Paul clearly views what happened as hypocritical and wrong. He said, he stood condemned, and enough that he called him out on it. Like, I imagine that what Peter did here, and then like it says, Barnabas and all the other Jews, which seems like everybody but Paul, went along with him. So it was enough of a movement that everyone noticed Peter did it, and they were like, oh yeah, okay, we're going to eat kosher stuff too. And they went over there as well. Which is like an example of how powerful a leader can go and affect leaders. I imagine that this happening made the Galatian Gentile Christians who were sitting there and go like, what? This great man from Jerusalem, Jesus' disciple, was just here eating with us, and now all of a sudden he's over there with those guys who are looking at us like this across the room. Like, that had to be jarring. And I'm imagining Paul like standing there and witnessing this and just being like, whoa, 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 hang on. This is not right, what you just did, Peter. Yesterday you were here, and now you're over there. I think it's especially amazing that Barnabas went. Like, I can imagine Peter, like, being in Jerusalem, like, caught up in the politics of it, but Barnabas has been this, like, traveling with Paul around, like, he knows all these people just as well, and this is the only negative thing said about Barnabas anywhere in the Bible. Everything else is, like, son of encouragement, stands up for John Mark, he's, like, really empathetic, and yet here, even he was, like, pulled aside, and only Paul was able to call it out. Okay, before we think about applications of this, hold on a second. If what Peter was doing was like, I'm just going to avoid conflict and go sit with the Jews. If that's what he was doing, doesn't Paul do that stuff all the time? Like, for example, just a little bit earlier in this passage, it talks about how Titus, a Gentile working with Paul, when they went to Jerusalem, was not forced to be circumcised when Paul was consulting with the pillars. But in Acts 16, which is probably later than this event in Galatians, almost certainly, Paul is like, picks up Timothy and is like, hey, we're going to be seeing some Jews out here, and they're going to be freaked out that your mom is a Gentile, or dad, I forget. So we're just going to circumcise you, so that's a little easier. And he circumcises Timothy. So in this story, he's like, yeah, circumcision bad. I didn't make Titus do it. But then later, he actually makes Timothy get circumcised. Because of the Jews who were in those places, is what it said in Acts. That's really interesting. Like, there are times that this is okay, apparently, where we like fit into the group and give up our freedoms, right? And Paul talks about it a bunch of different places, like in 1 Corinthians, where he says, I'm free from all, but I've made myself a servant to all so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I become as a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law I become as one under the law, even though I'm not under the law, so that I can win those under the law. But then to those outside the law, I become like them so that I might win those outside the law. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share that with them in its blessings. So there's something interesting here that I think helps us apply the lesson from this passage. That the motivation behind why you're doing something is the biggest reason, the biggest thing that matters. So in this case, we have circumcision, which is a neutral thing. In one case with Titus, it's when he was in Jerusalem, there were people coming up and talking with the pillars in Jerusalem. It says in verse 4, this matter arose because of the false brothers with false pretenses who slipped in unnoticed to spy on our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus to make us slaves. So there were people there saying, all the Gentiles need to be circumcised. And Paul was like, no, that would compromise the gospel. You can't do that to Titus. That's not what needs to happen. And he's saying the same thing is true here in Galatians when Peter came. But on the other hand, when he had Timothy with him, he said, let's do the circumcision, not because you have to, but because it'll remove an unnecessary offense to the people that we're going to go minister to. This is like Nita wearing a burqa in Somaliland. And there's a distinction in these two between fear of man and their judgment of you and serving others with freedom. And that's a really hard balance to strike and like very complicated. Because why do you do things? Do you know? It's kind of hard to know sometimes why you do something. Have you ever heard the idea like you have a different version of yourself in every group that you're in? So like there's a home you, there's a work you, there's a church you, there's an alone you. There's a version of you that is only present with just your spouse or like just your brother that no one else gets, because it just changes you just a little bit because you figured out how to relate in that setting. And I think it's unhealthy to imagine that you don't do that or that you shouldn't do that, because that's how humans are social creatures, and it's part of how we connect with each other as we adjust ourselves a little bit in all of these different groups. I think the question at hand that I'm throwing out may be more about how intentional those shifts are. Maybe you all of them intentional. But maybe some of them should be more than they are. Like when you're at work with non-believers and you're like fitting in, which is probably perfectly fine, are the ways that you're fitting in choices you're kind of like making. Like, I'm deciding I'm going to be really into this sport so that I can connect with these people. And are those ways of fitting in compromising the gospel in any way? Then that's probably not okay. But if they're not, even if they're like giving up something you think you don't need to be doing, but you're doing it anyway, that's probably fine. So for me, like this it's not as large of a question anymore, but like I grew up in a very conservative family, a very conservative like background. So when I go home, I would always wonder like, can I wear shorts? Silly question, but I was like, I don't want to wear pants just because I don't want mom to judge me or be mad at me, because I don't really think it's wrong. But like if that makes her be loved by me, then great. And I don't know, it was always hard to know whether like some of those kinds of questions are tough. And I think maybe the question is like, are there ways you change yourself to be in this group where like you feel like if you let something out, I don't know, is there something that you hide from this group because you're worried someone's going to think it's bad, even if it isn't? And like, is that good? I don't know. Those are questions that I was thinking through as I was considering this. But then, of course, the ultimate thing is what Peter was doing here, and Barnabas and everyone else did as well, was avoiding conflict at the expense of others. So they made a choice to go be on this team so that they didn't have to fight with them, but it left others out. And that seems to be a bigger deal than just like you yourself making a choice for yourself. But how often do you really make a choice just for yourself, right? It's not often. So I think we should be making choices in how we relate to different groups, how we deal with our freedoms in Christ, by thinking through how those choices will advance the gospel in whichever setting, and not about which creates the least amount of conflict for me in the short term. Okay. I have a few questions that I will throw out at all of you, but there's no slides. So you choose one of these questions to remember so that you have it for your group. Okay. The first is, have you ever followed a leader that you later realized was wrong in some way? And how did you realize that? Tradition or way of doing things at OCC that you would like to change? Third is, have you ever made intentional concessions to others in an effort to advance the gospel? And then the last one, what part of you is most likely to change in different groups, like work, church, home? Anyone need to do it again? Leader that you later realized was wrong, a tradition at OCC you want to change. Have you ever made intentional concessions to others for the gospel? And then what part of you changes the most when you switch groups?